Russia's war in Ukraine, which has amplified the global food crisis, has made the invader one of the biggest beneficiaries of the mess it helped create. A U.S. envoy blamed Russia for the worst food crisis since World War II, as reported by The Guardian. Russia and Ukraine contribute to 1/3 of the wheat and barley production, and 70% of its sunflower oil is exported. So it would not be surprising to say that the Russia-Ukraine war could be responsible for a food crisis in the world. How exactly did this war trigger this crisis? How grave is the crisis? How is it affecting the world? What is being done? Subscribe to our channel before we get into the nitty-gritty of the matter. Press the bell icon if you don't want to miss any sensational news. And like this video so we keep coming up with such videos. Russia-Ukraine war, which has rumored to be escalated and become World War III, has been affecting the world since it began. The stock markets crashed, the oil prices surged, and most importantly, the food crisis spread around the world. The global food crisis will continue this year, and supplies will not be safe until Russia's invasion of Ukraine is over, according to the U.S. Ambassador for Food, Cindy McCain. She also warned that U.S. funding for UN agencies working to alleviate the food crisis would be tight this year, and she urged financial market speculators not to use the turmoil to drive up prices even further. Due to Russia's war in Ukraine, grain is being prevented from leaving the breadbasket of the world and raising food prices worldwide, threatening to worsen shortages, hunger, and political instability in developing countries. Russia and Ukraine export nearly 1/3 of the world's wheat and barley, more than 70% of its sunflower oil, and a significant amount of corn. Russia is the world's leading producer of fertilizer. Food prices were already rising around the world, and the war amplified the situation by preventing some 20 million tons of Ukrainian grain from reaching the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Weeks of talks on safe corridors to get grain out of the Ukraine's Black Sea ports have yielded little progress, with the summer harvest season approaching. Normally, 90% of wheat and other grain produced in Ukraine is shipped to world markets by sea, but this has been hampered by the Russian blockades of the Black Sea coast. Some grain is being rerouted through Europe via rail, road, and river, but the amount is negligible compared to sea routes. Shipments are also slowed because Ukraine's rail gauges do not match those of its western neighbors. Markian Dimistrovich, Ukraine's deputy agricultural minister, asked European Union lawmakers for assistance in exporting more grain, including expanding the use of the Romanian port on the Black Sea, building more cargo terminals on the Danube River, and reducing red tape for freight crossing the Polish border. However, this means that food is even further away from those in need. Now you have to circle Europe to get back to the Mediterranean. It has increased the cost of the Ukrainian grain significantly, said Joseph Glauber, a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington. Since the beginning of the war, Ukraine has only been able to export 1.5 million to 2 million tons of grain per month, down from more than 6 million tons, according to Glauber. Russian grain is also not leaving the country. Moscow claims that Western sanctions on its banking and shipping industries prevent Russia from exporting food and fertilizer and discourage foreign shipping companies from transporting it. Russian officials insist that sanctions be lifted for grain to reach global markets. However, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and other Western leaders claim that sanctions do not apply to food. Ukraine has accused Russia of shelling agricultural infrastructure, stealing grain, and attempting to sell it to Syria after Lebanon and Egypt refused to buy it. Maxar Technologies' satellite images from late May show Russia-flagged ships loading grain into a port in Crimea before docking in Syria with their hatches open. According to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Russia has caused a global food crisis. The West agrees, with officials such as European Council President Charles Michel and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken claiming that Russia is weaponizing food. Russia claims exports will resume once Ukraine moves mines from the Black Sea and arriving ships are inspected for weapons. Russia's war in Ukraine has jolted global agricultural systems already reeling from the effects of the extreme weather and the pandemic flu. Although market conditions have improved in recent months, experts do not expect immediate relief, and this means more suffering for vulnerable communities already suffering from hunger. It also increases the risk of starvation and famine in countries such as Somalia, which is dealing with catastrophic food emergency, according to the UN. As per CNN, Carrie Fowler, the United States Special Envoy for Global Food Security, reported, all the major causes of the food crisis remain: conflict, COVID, climate change, high fuel prices. I believe we should brace ourselves for a difficult year in 2023. Food prices were rising prior to the invasion due to factors such as bad weather and poor harvest reducing supplies, while global demand recovered strongly following the COVID-19 pandemic. There are numerous reasons for this, including poor wheat harvests in the United States and Canada last year, as well as a drought in Brazil that reduced soybean yields. Climate change is also causing one of the worst droughts in 4 decades in the Horn of Africa, while a record-breaking heat wave in India in March reduced wheat yields. This, combined with rising fuel and fertilizer prices, has prevented other major grain-producing countries from filling the void. Some food experts have expressed concern that commodity market speculation, with traders betting on food prices and a monopoly of small number of companies physically trading in essential goods such as grain, has contributed to further price increases. Ukraine and Russia primarily export staples to developing countries, which are particularly vulnerable to price increases and shortages. Somalia, Libya, Lebanon, Egypt, and Sudan rely heavily on wheat, corn, and sunflower oil from the 2 warring nations. The poor are bearing the brunt of the burden, resulting in a humanitarian crisis. Aside from the threat of hunger, rising food prices threaten political instability in these countries. Developing country governments must either allow food prices to rise or subsidize costs. While a moderately prosperous country like Egypt, the world's top wheat importer, can also absorb higher food costs, poor countries like Yemen or the Horn of Africa must rely on humanitarian aid. Famine and starvation are ravaging that part of Africa. Prices for staples such as wheat and cooking oil have more than doubled in some cases, while millions of livestock used by families for milk and meat have died. The Russia-Ukraine conflict exacerbated years of domestic crisis in Sudan and Yemen. UNICEF has warned of an explosion of child deaths if the world focuses solely on the Ukraine conflict and fails to act. According to UN agencies, more than 200,000 people in Somalia face catastrophic hunger and starvation. 18 million Sudanese may face acute hunger by September, and 19 million Yemenis may face food insecurity this year. Wheat prices have risen by up to 750% in some of these countries. In general, everything has become more expensive. It's almost impossible to get enough water or food. These increases are fueling faster global inflation, making groceries more expensive. Some countries are responding by attempting to safeguard domestic supplies. India has restricted sugar and wheat exports, while Malaysia has suspended live chicken exports. Alarmed, Singapore, which imports 1/3 of its poultry from Malaysia, according to the International Food Policy Research Institute. If food shortages worsen as the war continues, more export restrictions may be imposed, driving up prices. Another threat is the scarcity and the high cost of fertilizer, which means that fields may be less productive as farmers cut corners. There are particularly severe shortages in 2 of the most essential fertilizer chemicals, both of which Russia is a major supplier. In response to these crises, responsible authorities are taking action to combat the situation. For weeks, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been attempting to reach an agreement that would allow Russia to resume grain and fertilizer exports, while also allowing Ukraine to ship commodities from a key port in Odessa. In the meantime, a large amount of grain is stuck in Ukrainian silos or on farms. And there's more to come. Ukraine's winter wheat harvest is set to begin soon, putting additional strain on storage facilities, even as some fields are likely to go unharvested due to the fighting. U.S. Vice President Joe Biden says he's working with European partners on a plan to build temporary silos alongside Ukraine's borders, including with Poland, a solution that would also address the disparities in rail gauges between Ukraine and Europe. The idea is that grain can be transferred into the silos, and then into cars in Europe. It would then be carried out to the ocean and across the world. There have been some encouraging signs. The index has fallen for 9 months in a row, and its December value was lower than a year ago. The sharp drop in the price of vegetable oils is a significant factor. Who should be blamed for all this, and what needs to be done? Do share your answers in the comments. The crisis is going to stay with us for at least this year, but it doesn't mean no one can do anything about it. Let's see if these measures prove fruitful in eradicating this crisis.